finally, windstorm was seen as something not affected by the actions of man or not affected by the urban form on the whole. So then we asked people about their priorities and perceptions in terms of the infrastructure that they thought was most important to be made resilient. So we wanted to understand from this what different people felt about what was the most important infrastructure. And we collected from the stakeholders and from households and businesses their views. And you can see that the households and businesses were pretty much agreeing on what were the priorities. The most important infrastructure, drainage and electricity. And as one of our respondents put it, electricity is most important for all, because without electricity, none of the other things will work. So that was pretty clear. Some of the other infrastructures that you might think were important, like the schools, so the education being maintained despite the flooding, despite the heat. The communities and the households found that less important, whereas the community leaders ranked that quite highly. They thought that was schooling in Makurdi was the most important thing to maintain during the climate crisis. Water was something that community leaders recognised as being important to maintain. And we can speculate about why that is. And some of the reasons might be about the individuals knowing that they have a good water supply, whereas the community leaders want to think about the water supply for everybody else. Sewage and telecommunications was something that people were less worried about. And then we asked people about their perceptions and priorities about what kind of adaptation would be important in order to cope with climate change. And again, we found some fairly similar views across some of our households and businesses. It was very common for households and businesses to call for government action, to create change, to manage the climate resilience. Whereas our government stakeholders were more interested in other things, laws and regulations. They were more interested in engineered solutions. There was a general tendency for people to want engineered solutions, technological solutions, rather than the softer environmental solutions that had been being advocated by the international literature. Economic solutions were not something that was recognised as important by any of our stakeholders. And behavioural solutions was least important of all. And this is something which in international literature is getting increasing focus. So we are looking at a mismatch between what people think is important in Nigeria and what international best practice might say should be important. So that's quite an interesting contrast. And when we took this to our stakeholder validation workshop, they also agreed that this was how people would see this. They saw this as what they would have expected to see. And they said there might be something about education, not education necessarily of the people, but education of the politicians to understand how these solutions could be helpful for Nigeria. So in summary, when we're talking about vulnerability to hazards, we came out with some findings. And this is from the whole of our data. So we saw that there were different exposure to hazards in different cities and across different populations. We saw that households and businesses are highly vulnerable to the impacts of the hazards, and they're most concerned about the direct impacts of the hazards to them and less concerned about indirect impacts and cultural heritage and other things which are more communal. The vulnerability is linked to resilience of infrastructure as well as socio-demographics. So it's not just about equity between those that have and those that have not. Everybody is disrupted when the road is flooded. A major challenge to adaptation is seen as finance. Finance is very important, but there's also tenure and whether people are able to adapt their properties or whether they need to rely on somebody else to do it for them. And there was also a difference in concern expressed across the cities. So some people were more concerned than others, even though they might be subject to the same exposure, because they felt they could cope better. As a side show, really, when we did our surveys in McCurdy, we were using a new technique for us. We were using Open Data Kit. So on mobile phones, our research assistants were going to individual households and businesses and collecting the data and then sending it up to the cloud where it was all collated at the end of the day for us. Saved a lot of time in entering paper forms. This is a free and open source software that anybody can use. So it's not something that you need to have the DFID money behind you to use. It's just about having a bit of data and downloading it to your mobile smartphone. And the advantage of that was it also geo-referenced our data. So we were able then to do some nice plots, spatial plots. So this is just an example, a couple of examples of those spatial plots showing the distribution of flooding in the households in the 5 years. And you can see each individual household is a spot. The green ones were not impacted by flooding, the red ones were. And the other thing that we've created from this georeference data is the elevations that you see there. So we didn't have a map of elevation, but we created one from our respondents because the elevation was one of the georeferences that we got out of the data. So that was a very interesting. You can see that in general, the people on the heights on one side of the river were not flooded quite easily there. And when we looked at urban heat, we could do the same thing. So the people, as more people were impacted by urban heat than by flooding. And we can see there that some of the people on the heights weren't impacted, but there's also a density factor there. So how close are you to your neighbour in terms of, and how big is your house? That might determine how impacted you are by urban heat. Thank you. We asked people whether they received climate information, and here was an interesting difference between Calabar and McCurdy. So we asked them who did they like to receive information from and who did they receive information from about climate hazards. And in McCurdy we can see far fewer people actually received information, but I've split this as if it was 100%. I'm looking at percentages here, and you can see that within Calabar a lot more people receive their information from business and industry. And there may be the explanation of the gap between the people in McCurdy receiving information and those in Calabar. But in general, people like to receive their information from the state and from local government. We also asked them how they coped with flooding. And I was very encouraged and inspired by these results, because if I do similar studies as this, like this in England, I see much, much lower numbers of people saying that they know about strategies to cope with flooding and that they would do the things that they need to do to cope with flooding. So what we see in Nigeria is a population that's very ready to help themselves. They're very ready to get involved in protecting their valuables by moving them upstairs, by having access to information, by moving themselves to a safe place, and even by doing some of the more expensive or costly measures like elevating their house than you would see in similar surveys in England. The one thing that you would see that's very different if you were doing this survey in England is the ability to buy flood insurance. So practically everybody in England would have flood insurance, but of course here in Nigeria it's not so readily available, and also not such a part of the cultural expectation. So we see actually very similar patterns of willingness to cope with flooding in both of the cities, even more similar than in the attitudes to adaptation. And then we come to the theory. How do we measure? I can't really go into this, but I would recommend that anybody who wants to know about vulnerability and resilience looks at Qatar Susan Cutter from the US, we used her concepts to set up a set of resilience indicators for the cities. And those resilience covered social, economic, financial, institutional, community resilience. And we compared the two. So you can see there we've got scores for economic, social, infrastructural, community capital and institutional resilience. We don't see much difference between the two cities, apart from around infrastructure, community capital. The infrastructural resilience is about the kind of electricity, I think, that different communities would be using. And then you can break it down, because we had such good rich data. You can look within a city. So these are the 22 local wards in Calabar. And the differences between wards are greater, really, than the differences between cities. So we have 22 wards, and we're just looking here at household economic resilience. So the economic resilience of households varies greatly between the wards. And you can explain that if you break it down still further by looking at what we included in those indicators. So non-agricultural employment, the perceived security of employment, perceived wealth, the poverty thresholds, and whether you own your own house. And again, you can see that in the different wards in Calabar here, they were very different measurements and very different levels of resilience. These can be very useful tools for local and state governments and for city governments. So in summary, conclusions, climate hazards are an important issue in Nigerian cities. There's a shared belief in the human causes of hazards. There's a shared concern about them across the cities, and the necessary compliance which is not readily available in Nigerian cities. There are calls for infrastructure measures to reduce risk, and that's very common across all populations. There's hazard experience which varies within cities. There's resilience and vulnerability which varies within cities. This is a complex issue that needs to be dealt with locally. And that household and business adaptation is common. People are adapting. But actually, the community-led approaches were quite low, so people don't know who to turn to, and there are no communities which are working together to deal with these hazards. So the implications of this is that sustainable planning and sustainable water management are relevant in Nigeria, but there's a lack of capacity to implement some of these things, detailed maps, and some capacity in and training of personnel. There's a great willingness to undertake individual action, and this could be capitalised upon by creating community-led approaches that brought together that money in order to create capital for all. Indiscriminate application of laws will impact the most vulnerable, and regulations need to think about that. So the equity issues around taking a legal approach to this need to be thought through very carefully. And these resilience indicators that we developed could possibly be used widely to have a look at what are the resilience of these populations. And therefore, the recommendations that follow from those. State governments should consider, as recommended in the adaptation policy of the Nigerian government, to go cross-departmental here and to set up a ministry for climate hazards. There should be promotion of climate champions, people who really understand this, within communities. So trying to set up a community approach to this because of the willingness of people to be engaged, but the lack of anywhere for them to engage. Risk assessments should be undertaken at multiple scales, not just a national assessment, but local and citywide assessments. And more resources should then be made available once the risk is understood in order for people to adapt. Strong consideration should be given to enactment of building codes to help people to understand how they can adapt to these new climate stresses. And agencies should consider the use of these resilience measures, not just within a city, but across cities, to understand where the priority for funding should be. Acknowledgements, the research team and participants. We work very closely with our Nigerian partners and with our research assistants in accomplishing this. And that's just our outputs. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Lamont. Another round of applause. That's a wonderful presentation, highly stimulating and thought-provoking. We entertain questions and answers, just 5 minutes. Questions, let's signify from the audience. Questions, Prof. Any other person? Number 2. Thank you, Prof.
I want to congratulate Prof, and that was a very good one. My worry is this. Could this be taken as a general Nigerian study or specific location study? Because if we take this as a Nigerian study, it will be very, very misleading from the methodology. Those 4 places that you mentioned, they represent a particular enclave, in Nigeria. We cannot compare this result with what we will probably get here in Niger Delta, in far north, Maiduguri. So it will be very, very misleading to take this as a model for Nigeria. And I think we have to be very cautious. We don't know how far this is going to take the group, and that caution must be taken. That's just my observation. Well done. God bless.
Thank you very much. The presentation was very good. Actually, my question is related to Professor Fadari's question, and it has to do with justification for your study area. I did a study similar to yours, but like you said, we have different ecological zones in Nigeria. We have the northwest, the northeast, and they have their own peculiarities. And the way they experience their own climate change is quite different. Now, and apart from that, even their means of adaptation, their whole indigenous, apart from the general one, they have their own peculiar indigenous way of adapting to the situation. Now, bringing it to why I asked the justification for selecting those areas, we might not really be able to generalize, because it's like you picked Makurdi, Lokoja, Calabar, and Enugu. It's somehow, it's skewed towards an area. There are some areas that we really know that they are really experiencing it in full force. So I would rather suggest that, or I don't know, maybe this is just, I don't know how to put it. Maybe part of the study. Thank you.
You may please respond.
Thank you for that very good couple of questions, which more or less address, as you say, the same issue. So why did we select the places that we selected? It's a really good question, and all PhD students should be able to answer that question. So I hope I can answer that to your satisfaction. And then about how generalizable are the results of this study. So I didn't have time to go into detail, but I can say that one of the challenges that we had when we started this project was that there were some places we were not allowed to travel to. So we couldn't take the full range of geography into account in terms of actual study. So we did look in the report in literature across the whole of Nigeria, and we appreciate very strongly that there are different geopolitical zones and there are different climate challenges in different parts of Nigeria. But we were constrained by the project to work in particular cities that were around the size of a state capital, and that in particular we were very interested in looking at areas that had flooded in 2012 very severely. So that's the rationale for choosing Benue and Lokoja. When we started looking at Enugu, In Nugu, it was in order to see whether the wonderful urban planning that we'd heard about made any difference in Enugu compared to some of the other cities, and also Calabar. We were not allowed to look at Lagos and this area because the cities are too big and they'd been too heavily studied. So I was under constraints. Having said that, generalizability of the study, some of the detailed findings about what people will do and what their climate stresses are and what their priorities of adaptation are may change. And we're not saying that our study has captured that for all hazards across the whole of Nigeria, but what we're saying is that the methods that we've used can be used by local governments and state governments to evaluate the same sort of issues. So it's more to say that our methodology is useful in evaluating this before imposing particular kinds of solutions on populations. So don't take, I think that was I hope that came through, don't take a national approach to this, take a local approach, and then that means you have to replicate this kind of study in different cities in Nigeria. And of course we couldn't do that for financial reasons and for political reasons, but we hope that the work that we've done will show how this could be taken forward. And many of the rather larger conclusions and recommendations could be more generalizable in terms of the resilience of this population in terms of self-help rather than community-led practice. So some of those, I think, our stakeholder validation workshop, which had people from all over the country, they validated those findings and they found them to be strong and true for Nigeria. And that was partly the purpose for doing the validation workshop.
Thank you, Prof. Before we break out to our parallel sessions, we go straight to appreciate our distinguished speakers. I have the kind permission of the Dean and the Chairman of the LOC to respectfully invite Professor Paul Olomolaye. Professor Paul Olomolaye, please. Dean, Chairman LOC. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. While sorting out the plaques, I want to ask Professor Jessica Labond that if you want to extend your study, make Ife one of your study areas and involve our students and our members of staff in getting your data and analyzing. Or are we not interested? Thank you. So we want to give this to, okay. Actually what we're giving, we can't pay back because there's no way we can appreciate you, sir, for all that you have done, all that you are doing now and what you will still do. And actually when the LOC came to me, the committee members, they were asking for money for the tickets. I was like, how will I get money for this ticket? And when we were just trying to gather money and sort out things, he just sent me a mail that they have bought the tickets for the two of them. So they sponsored themselves to this place. Sincerely speaking, we didn't pay a kobo. We did not pay a kobo. So we appreciate you, sir. Thanks so very much. So in appreciation of what you have done for us, we want to give this to you. Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. The next person, which are the next slide? Okay. Professor of Architecture. Let me ask the Professor Fadari to help us present this as the past dean of the faculty. And as the man that is so concerned about the cost of your change.
Well, Professor Emo Adebamo, could you please rise and move closer to me so that I will not die young? On behalf of the Faculty of Environmental Design and Management of this beautiful Obafemi Awolowo University, Ile-Ife, collaboration with others. I present to you Professor M.A. Adibomowo. In appreciation of your contribution towards the success of this conference as the lead speaker, we will call you back again next year. God bless you.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, to further appreciate Professor Adebam. So the next we go to those that took us yesterday on quantitative and qualitative, and one of them is around now. Okay, I think Professor Olotua will be okay. You are representing him. It's okay. Professor Kufoni Isa, come and help us present this. I was not around. I didn't stay all through yesterday, but I heard that you should have read mathematics and not architecture.
So, on behalf of the faculty of EDM,
this one goes to Dr. Aronsiola, and the chairman of LOC is standing in for him. Let's ask Professor Odobolaye to present this.
On behalf of the Edmic 2019, and for the excellence of Dr. Aronsiola, so we want to say thank you very much, and thanks for all that he has done for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sirs and ma'ams. I have some few announcements here. Before we proceed for lunch, we want to take a group photograph. Can we take the photograph now? Group photograph with the keynote speakers and all the professors, faculty professors, please. Please come forward, sir. All faculty professors, the vice dean, you may please join them. Vice dean and faculty professors. All L of departments, with the kind permission